Bonsoir. Merci d'être nombreux d'après ce que je vois. Je vais parler un tout petit peu en français et ensuite tout le reste se passera en anglais puisque nos panélistes sont anglophones ce soir. Ce que je voulais vous dire en français, c'est que lorsqu'on a réfléchi avec Caroline Aboussada au panel de ce soir, assez rapidement est venue cette question qui parle encore des Palestiniens. Mais en fait, en anglais, on pourrait la traduire par « who cares ?» Qui s'en fiche ou qui s'occupe encore, qui pense encore à la Palestine, aux Palestiniens, qui se préoccupe encore des Palestiniens. Et effectivement, la question peut se poser à un moment où les soutiens traditionnels des Palestiniens s'effondrent les uns après les autres, à un moment où, par exemple, Israël demande à l'Égypte d'adoucir le blocus de la bande de Gaza, parce que franchement, ça va poser un problème humanitaire, à un moment où l'Arabie saoudite réfléchit à faire une coalition avec Israël contre l'Iran et adopte vis-à-vis des Palestiniens, en tout cas certains dirigeants saoudiens, je pense notamment au prince héritier, Mohammed Ben Salman, adopte un langage qui ressemble exactement à celui adopté par Israël pour décrire le conflit israélo-palestinien. À un moment où les États-Unis déménagent leur ambassade de Tel Aviv à Jérusalem et donc reconnaissent de facto Jérusalem comme capitale d'Israël, alors même que les Nations Unies ne le font pas, que l'Union européenne ne le fait pas, ni la Russie, ni la Chine, unilatéralement, et sont suivis par un certain nombre de pays, d'Amérique latine en particulier. Donc, les signes sont évidents d'un désintérêt, voire d'une volonté de ne plus s'occuper du conflit israélo-palestinien, en tout cas en vue de le régler, mais juste de le gérer. Seulement, ces signes qui font que on voit de manière évidente des diplomates se baisser les bras, abandonner des initiatives, etc., se passent à un moment où le public, lui, comme le montre le film, et on va en parler, du moins un certain public est plus intéressé, plus mobilisé, peut-être même plus engagé qu'avant. En tout cas, votre présence le prouve, qui parle encore des Palestiniens, en tout cas qui veut en entendre parler, il y a suffisamment de monde. Donc je vais appeler ce soir pour en parler Noura Erakat. You are invited. Alors, Noura Erakat is an American, a Palestinian, a teacher at George Mason University. She's teaching humanitarian law, human rights, refugees law as well. She wrote a book about the law and the use of law in the occupation in Israel. Is it true? Almost, yes. And you are teaching as well you used to teach in Georgetown University. You are the co-founder of Jadaliya, which is a very interesting online magazine on the Middle East. And you will talk to us about the American policy and American politics as well. I am very pleased to host as well Michael Link, who is Special Rapporteur for the United Nations on the situation in the Palestinian occupied territories. You're teaching as well in London, Ontario. You're in a very difficult position because you are always accused of doing too much or too less. So we will discuss about the changes of the international law and its use in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I'm pleased to host Samim Shasha, who is the spokesman for UNRWA. UNRWA is one of the very first agencies in the history of the United Nations, a very important and special agency, which was from the very beginning in charge of the Palestinian refugees, specifically Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is under a very difficult situation in terms of finance, but in terms as well of its existence, because some US ambassador, for example, at the United Nations, a former ambassador at the United Nations, but not such a long time ago, suggested that the Palestinian refugees should be treated as any refugees in the world. And that they don't deserve a specific agency in the UN. So we will see the consequences of this kind of moves and decisions. First, I wanted to ask you all, maybe to you, Noura, your reactions in a few words to the film.
Sure. Good evening. Good evening. Should I risk and say bonsoir? So I think I have the esteemed privilege of being the only American on the panel, which means that this is a daily reality for us, and quite frankly was very, very triggering, as much as we've lived it, to watch it again over and over. And you know, it's almost like being in a room with a bag of baby poop and you can't smell it, but then when you step out of the room and come back, then it's really pungent. So this was what it was like watching this, because when we're in it, we tend to forget and we become desensitized. My initial commentary is this. I think everything in here was absolutely accurate. I have, also have been part of the media maelstrom, and so have been subject to a number of questions and been accused of being Hamas's attorney or its lackey. But one of the things I just want to highlight is that this overemphasizes as if that the element of the media is in fact what is driving US policy in Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East. In the same way that sometimes we hear about the overemphasis on the power of the lobby as over-determining US behavior in the Middle East. And so 2 comments about that. Number 1, what we see here in the media is not limited just to media, nor is it limited to the United States. I was in Australia recently, and after the killing of 3 Palestinian youth, the first question the commentator asked me was, isn't this Hamas's fault? So this isn't just about the US, but the second question that the commentator asked me was another question I often get, which is, don't you think that the United Nations singles out Israel? Which indicates the second point I'm making, that this is also at the United Nations. That this is also part of government policy, that this is also part of the ways that the laws of war, so I study the laws of war. The laws of war, Israeli scholars, the judiciary, have all acted in concert to change the laws of war to make what seems reprehensible and as a war crime into a proposition for new terms of engagement when fighting terrorists. So that we can't overemphasize any single field as explaining this horrific situation. And then the second point, and I hope I get into this more, I don't want to take up too much time right now, which is this also makes it seem as if, but for the lobby or the media or some external intervention, the US would act in good conscience. We cannot forget the US is an imperial power in the Middle East and in the rest of the world. We cannot forget that the US is a settler colony. We cannot forget that the US is built on a racial caste system founded on slavery and the commodification and the turning of black people into property. So this is something that's deeply ingrained in American consciousness as well. It's not as if they single out the Palestinians to be evil to. We have a deep crisis in the United States that I think we should also be very honest about.
Thank you very much. Michael, what is your comment? Is the UN always pointing Israel?
It's a very good question because it comes up repeatedly with respect to my mandate as the Special Rapporteur with respect to human rights in the occupied territories that Israel has been in since 1967. And when I hear the criticism that the UN is particularly singling out or unfairly singling out Israel, I say no. I say those resolutions that you see in the United Nations General Assembly, those resolutions that you see in the Human Rights Council, which will be actually debated all next week here in Geneva, aren't aiming at Israel. They're aiming at the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. They're aiming at the longest current military occupation in the world. If Israel wasn't in the occupied territories, Israel would be treated probably like any other nation with its own particular flaws and its own human rights particular issues in the same way my country, Canada, would wind up being. Israel is, there are a number of resolutions that will come up next week and continue to come up because of the occupation. That is what the issue is, not Israel itself. And if I can just comment briefly on the film, but to use as a parallel, what this film led as its thesis was the disfiguring of the issue of Palestine through the media in America, which is obviously probably the single most important country with respect to deciding what the fate is of Israel and Palestine in the world. As a parallel issue, I often deal with, in my mandate as Special Rapporteur, the disfiguring of international law. And it always winds up surprising me because, yes, lawyers can argue over various issues. We can argue over facts, we can argue over interpretation. In fact, we often wind up doing that. But there are few issues in the modern world with respect to international law where there is such a wall-to-wall consensus as the fact that this is an occupation, that the settlements that are there are illegal, that the annexation of East Jerusalem is an annexation and therefore unlawful under international law. There are a handful of scholars and Israeli government spokespeople who will wind up disputing that. But in raising those issues, it sometimes confuses us, particularly those of us who aren't lawyers, those of you who aren't lawyers, as to think, well, it's a he said, or she said kind of debate.
So it's not only a PR question, it's a question of law.
Yes, exactly. So that's my approach, and that's what I've drawn from this film, is looking at the parallel as it comes to how we look at international law.
Sami, your comment on this film and from your point of view, dealing with refugees. For example, in this film, there is a lot. This film was about a war, which is 2014 war in Gaza. Gaza, more than half of the population are refugees. So, and they are fed, educated by UNRWA. They are, during that war, they were protected, and it was 2008. Some were protected into UNRWA headquarters and bombed despite of that. What kind of situation is it for UNRWA?
Yeah, thank you, Masal Khair. Bonjour, bonsoir. It is very difficult for me after 30 years working for UNRWA. I always find it difficult to put into words emotions and also what the reality is in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, by the way. I was born and raised in East Jerusalem, and for the past 30 years I've been working with UNRWA. And I will just basically make some points about the film. When you saw the caterpillars destroying homes, it is extremely difficult process because I have to demolish my own home. To obtain a permit, to build a permit, you have to wait about maybe 10 years and then the permit doesn't come. So most of the Palestinians build their houses without a permit. And I did the same. So they give you the option. Would you like to demolish your home by yourself, or would you like us to demolish it for you? If we demolish it for you, you have to pay also for demolishing act in that sense. So, and then when you look at the scenes in Gaza, we lost 18 of our colleagues, people I worked with for 30 years. So it gets almost emotional sometimes to speak about it and put it almost in basically factual format in that sense. The film talks about the matrix of control, which is a very interesting term. The matrix of control that the Israeli forces introduces in the occupied territories is not only checkpoints, and it's not only armed soldiers. It's much, much more than that. It's the taxation process. If you live in East Jerusalem, as I do, it's almost difficult to survive because the matrix of control is economic as much as military. It's emotional as much as it's political. It's also mental, and the mental part is the most important one. I'm almost fatigued. After 30 years, I feel a sense of fatigue because even though the film ends on a positive note, that the trend is changing in the States, maybe the argument could be made that in Europe, there's an opposite trend that is coming that is scary. And when you see rightist, exclusivist parties popping their heads in Europe and aligning themselves with certain parties in Israel and with the right in the States, then you also have to worry. UNRWA is in an extremely difficult situation. You would think that after 70 years, we would have basically took strides into finding a solution to the genesis of the problem. The film concentrates more on 67 onward, but the problem started in the 1948, 1950. UNRWA was basically all along with the refugees. I studied in UNRWA schools, so I wanted to pay back and work with UNRWA for the past 30 years. And I think that in many areas we are regressing and we're not progressing as much as we are progressing. You're talking about 526,000 students in our schools. There's no hope for them. There is no hope for them. There is 70% of the population in Gaza are refugees, and they are productive people. They have people with dignity and pride, and yet when they find themselves having to queue in line to get UNRWA food from UNRWA, doctors, nurses, engineers, productive people, when they are reduced into a blockade for 12, 13 years, and when they have to basically survive on handouts from UNRWA. Every 3 months, UNRWA have to distribute food and other basic commodities for 1 million Palestinian refugees in Gaza because there's no other alternative solutions. We issued a report, Gaza 2020, in which we basically proved as a UN system, including UNRWA, that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020 on all measures in that sense. And on top of that, you would think that you would be able now in 2019 to deliver better services, to give more hope for the students in Gaza and in the occupied territories of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Yet it's the opposite. The campaign that was launched against UNRWA in 2018 financially and existentially almost torpedoed the entire work. So the film is good, the trend is there, but the other final point, and I'm sorry for taking long, is that the narrative that you heard about, which is extremely positive, the narrative of young Jewish kids aligning themselves with Palestinian kids and others of the world and concocting their own narrative forward, misses always in these things the Palestinian own narrative. If you notice in the movie, which is perfect and positive, is that many of them are Jewish or Americans speaking on the issue, and yet maybe one or two Palestinians speaking their mind. The Palestinians also have to find their voice, and the others have to allow them to speak their voice. Sorry for taking long.
Thank you, and especially in the US, we will discuss it. I have like tens of questions, and time will be not enough. But first, your remark about the fact that Europe is going a different way, I wanted to confirm, because this film was made in 2016. This year, even last month, we had a heated discussion in France about trying to punish anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, exactly as mentioned in the film. It's not clear how it will end up. We had last autumn, a few months ago, an attempt of the Israeli ambassador to try to prevent the screening of a film at a French TV channel before being seen by anybody. It was exactly the same kind of attempt to censor something before it was aired by the TV. So we have the same kind of, at least to speak about France, we have the same kind of pressures and debates. Maybe the main trend is not the same because they are more diverse opinions on the subject. If I want to still speak about the film, but as well about what's happening right now, what is the main difference between 2016 and today? I would call it Donald Trump, who changed many parameters of the conflict and the way you look at it. Noura, for example, there is this this scene where Barack Obama is attacked because of recalling the traditional position of the US. But the traditional position of the US diplomacy does not exist.
That's really interesting. So I guess I get the question. I didn't vote for Trump. So I want to say that one of the things that we've seen in the United States as a trend is the rise of a so-called resistance movement to Trump that has framed itself as a political resistance, but only by definition an antagonism to Trump. And as far as I'm concerned, that is not a resistance. That is not a resistance, because he might represent the most right-wing interpretation of certain policies, but he is not the source of them. His election did not change the course of policy in the Middle East. It just made them more plain. Since 1967, this movie said that it began with Richard Nixon, who inaugurated a special relationship with Israel, but I would argue it was Lyndon B. Johnson, in the course of the 1967 war, seeing as Israel was able to defeat several Arab armies singularly, found in Israel a Cold War asset and initiated in that year something called a qualitative military edge, which is a policy of ensuring that Israel can defeat together or severally all of the Arab states combined. So that's when we begin to provide Israel with the greatest amount of unequivocal military aid. And at the same time, because we want to protect Israel, that is when we begin to protect it diplomatically, and why between 1967 and the present, the US has issued 43 vetoes in the Security Council, which, by the way, is not necessarily unprecedented. The US did that in one other case, when it was protecting apartheid in South Africa and Namibia. But since 67, these successive US presidents have all done the same thing, which is talk out of two sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they've said, we believe in ending the occupation and a return to the 1967 borders per Security Council Resolution 242. On the other side of its mouth, it has been providing unequivocal diplomatic, military, and economic aid to Israel. So, in fact, basically sustaining the condition that we see. It was the Obama administration, which is seen as the most liberal, which issued its first veto in the Security Council to shoot down a resolution condemning settlements that was verbatim US policy. But we forgive Obama because he's seen as the pathbreaker, a liberal in office who now we pine over and miss. And forget this, it was the Obama administration that increased US aid to Israel from $3 billion a year to $3.8 billion a year over a 10-year period, $38 billion in a 10-year MOU. And yet, when Trump comes into office, all of a sudden the U.S. wants to forgive itself for our policy over 5 decades in order to place the blame on somebody who is in fact a monster. And he is. And he has done things that are horrible, like slash $364 million to UNRWA, like slash $200 million in aid under U.S. aid, like moving the embassy, the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. All of that is quite horrible, but in fact is part of a continuum of U.S. policy in which we've been participating. And I believe that in fact, if we want to see a difference, we can't obscure that history, because if we remove Trump, we'll only return to a status quo that is just as violent, but that wears liberal clothing.
Okay, that's very clear. But when you are inside the UN, when you are reporting to the Security Council, do you feel a difference of norms, of laws, of reference?
Yes, and look, my reports, as you read them, and I'm issuing my 6th report on Monday. I've been in the position now for exactly 3 years out of a 6-year term. I'm always grounding my arguments with respect to international law, but I'm also pointing out, as per your question, about how things are changing and changing for the worse. This occupation is thickening. This occupation is getting deeper. This occupation as well, I have to insist, will not die of old age. And if you ask me the difference between 2016 and now, let me try to answer it this way. At the very end of 2016, in December the 23rd, 2016, the Security Council of the United Nations adopted Resolution 2334. The United States did not veto it. It abstained and allowed the resolution to go through. And among other things, it said that the settlements are a flagrant violation of international law and said that they should end. It also said that all countries must make a distinction in their dealings between Israel and the territories that it's occupying. But there's one thing I do want to point out, which I thought was a grave error in Resolution 2334. It said that the occupation is not sustainable. And that actually has been the position of most of the West over the last 15 to 20 years and remains the position today. And if you would allow me a minute to give a counter-argument to that, since the beginning of 2017, since the end of, obviously, the time period of this movie, since then, the Israeli settlement enterprise has witnessed the greatest number of construction starts since the year 2000. Secondly, the Knesset in those last 2 years has adopted legislation to retroactively legalize a number of unauthorized outposts in the occupied territories and to legitimize the confiscation of Palestinian private land in the West Bank for Jewish settlements. Third, Israel has consolidated its presence in what is known as Area C, which makes up 60% of the West Bank, that Israel has exclusive military, security, and civil authority over. Fourth, the Israeli leadership is now becoming much more open about its vision for a permanent occupation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that the most that he would yield the Palestinians would be a state minus. In other words, Israel keeps all of the Jordan Valley, all of the Israeli settlement blocks, and what's left, the 20 or 30 or most 40% of the West Bank, is what would become a Palestinian statelet. Israel, I think, would be happy to have the Palestinian leadership sign on those terms. You can have a seat at the United Nations, you can have your own stamps, you can have your own flag that you can fly anywhere that you want, but the rest winds up being ours. And of course, as you've mentioned, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is now becoming a humanitarian catastrophe.
But do you see major actors, especially the US, as far as we are speaking about the US policy, more receptive to this vision of accepting the occupation, of annexing the major settlement blocks, and speaking about occupation only in the case of what they so-called illegal settlements.
Yeah.
Or all the settlements should be illegal, but now they are concentrating on illegal outposts.
Yes, either yesterday or today, the U.S. State Department issued its annual report with respect to human rights. And it, for the first time ever in the last 30 years, since these 35 years, or almost 40 years now, I guess, since this has been issued beginning with Jimmy Carter, it removed the term occupation from describing Israel's control over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. So I think that marks another signpost of where American policy is going with this. And if you follow the statements, who I think are some of the leading decision makers from the American administration, the current American ambassador to Israel, Jason Greenberg, as well as President Trump's son-in-law, Jason Kushner, that the peace plan that would be revealed sometime after the Israeli election is over, sometime in the spring, will offer, will make an offer to the Palestinians that they cannot accept. And one of my views, one of the things I at least could foresee happen, is that Israel will say to the United States, the Palestinians have spit upon your peace plan. What else would you expect from them? Please allow us now to go forward and to have the areas you were going to give to us anyways. And there would be then a move from a de facto annexation, perhaps to a formal annexation of the settlement blocks, certainly the big settlements around Jerusalem, and quite possibly the Jordan Valley as well. This is where I think we're heading from, with respect, annexation is in the air.
Mm-hmm. From the UNRWA point of view, what is the main idea of this attack that you are witnessing for a year and a half now? Is it a question of principle or a question of means? Is UNRWA, do the US ask the disappearance of UNRWA because UNRWA was in a way the reason or the instrument of the vehicle of the Palestinian identity during all those years of occupation?
Yeah. First, many of the things that I will speak in my own personal capacity and not necessarily as a spokesman for UNRWA. And that allows me, if you like, that space to speak also from my perspective as a Palestinian refugee.
Yeah, of course.
The end or the beginning of the end of the two-state solution, which was manifested in the movie, and not only the tripling, but the quadrupling of the number of the settlers in the West Bank, let alone in East Jerusalem, is basically, and one of the commentators in the film basically have posed, there's nothing left to speak about when it comes to, there's no state to speak about anymore in that sense. So with this basically unfolding, and while there is positive developments, as we saw today, in people changing their minds on the entire conflict, in reality, the de facto situation on the ground is most likely there's no space for the Palestinian state to be created. With this in mind, and that comes to your question, what happened in the past 2 years since this movie was made, is that the attention now is going to two other very key issues to seal the deal, to seal the non-existence of a Palestinian state. One is the issue of Palestine refugee, and the other issue is Jerusalem. And this is where the...
Which were, sorry for the audience, but which were the main two issues that prevented a deal, if you listen to the negotiators in 2000. I mean, it was not the only reason, but it was the official reason. Or
I didn't get you.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
I was saying that those two key issues were the two issues that they officially did not manage to find a solution during the discussions of the summer 2000 in Camp David, and then later on when Clinton tried a last-minute attempt, even if the trends were not good and the confidence was not there.
Yeah. And this is actually the point I wanted to say, because the final status issues tackled many sensitive issues, including borders, security, Jerusalem, refugees. The two issues that most the protagonists couldn't agree on, which is refugee and Jerusalem, they basically pushed it aside. Now, with the two-state solution evaporating, the attention in the past 2 years had shifted back to Jerusalem, even though it was always present. But there was more focus on it, as well as the Palestinian refugee issue. And this is where UNRWA comes into play. The United States, since 1950, was the largest donor for UNRWA, simply because it was regarded by the Americans and many other UNRWA supporters and donors that it's a source of stability. UNRWA is a source of stability. And actually, some of the people who don't like UNRWA say that UNRWA subsidized the occupation because occupying power was supposed to take care of the people that occupied, and here comes UNRWA with its schools and clinics doing the work of the occupier. So now, with the shift and the changes that we're seeing on the two-state solution, now is the time many of the anti-UNRWA detractors and the people who don't like the issue of refugee as such are turning attention to the refugee issue. You cannot touch it by changing the mindset of the Palestinian refugee. You cannot tell him that you or she, when you wake up in the morning, you're no longer a Palestinian refugee, but you could basically eat at this issue from the perspective of UNRWA. And that is why the US, which was the largest donor for UNRWA, basically stopped $360 million from UNRWA, and that put UNRWA in a tailspin. We almost folded last year. We could barely keep our schools open. We barely were able to basically keep our clinics open and our other humanitarian services. If it wasn't for the other friends of UNRWA, the Europeans and the Asians and the Muslim countries and the Arab states, who still believe that there's a role for UNRWA, we would have unfolded. And the other issue is Jerusalem.
Did they compensate?
They did compensate. Not only that, we started last year, we had a budget deficit of $446 million out of a budget of total budget of $1.2 billion. And for an agency like UNRWA, which depends on voluntary contributions from member states directly, for it to go and to compensate this amount and to close the year with no budget deficit, that's a huge testament. On the flip side of it is that still many people believe that the refugee issue cannot be swept under the carpet, and certain international law regulations, UN resolutions say that they have legitimate rights, and these rights cannot be basically whitewashed away. The interesting thing is the intersection between the Palestine refugee issue and Jerusalem, and the fact that there's 110,000 Palestinian refugees like myself who reside in Jerusalem. That also was an extremely sensitive issue. And in 2018, we faced a tremendous pressure on UNRWA. And the film talks about the watch groups. One of the watch groups is dedicated exclusively to UNRWA. This is a very well-oiled machine, well-staffed, well-financed, and their job is to try to dig as much dirt as UNRWA, and if you can find it, fabricated in that sense. And I'll give you just one example. They go to our schools. They do not present themselves as journalists. They basically masquerade as a journalist. Then they wait for a nine-year-old student from our schools. He is leaving the school. They wait for him with cameras, posing as cameras, speaking Arabic, and they start a conversation with this kid. And ultimately, an 8 or 9-year-old kid who is impressionable will fall into saying certain things, whether against the Jews or against Israel or against this and that. They package it, and you see, I mean, this movie is a rarity when it comes to explaining the situation in real life. But for one film like this, there's 200-300 clips and films and videos that portrays the Palestinians completely the opposite way. And these things were used in Congress with the senators and the Congress people in the states, and it hurt us, and we lost $360 million. So what changed the past 2 years is that there's this refound focus on the refugee issue and in Jerusalem issue, but also with the same trend like they did with the two-state solution. We were almost done with the two-state solution. Let's now turn our attention to the refugee issue and move it away, and hopefully with Jerusalem and move it away in that sense.
Can I add to that?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to add to that. I just want to, emphasize that there is a desire and a movement and a concerted effort to resolve this issue through fiat, what cannot be quelled. This is a liberation movement. These are people fighting for freedom, with other people all over the world fighting for freedom. And yet what we see is this concerted effort to change the definition, to basically hold a humanitarian situation hostage in order to surrender. I mean, that's literally what it is. And part of this, in the specific regard to UNRWA and in regards to refugee law, the main objection to UNRWA, which is created in 1949, 2 years before the UNHCR or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is created, the main objection to it is that it considers the descendants of Palestinian refugees as refugees also entitled to the right of return. And many of those, ardent pro-Israelis, I should say, argue that because we consider all the descendants of refugees, that means that there's 6 million Palestinian refugees who want to return. But if we only counted those that were expelled from their homes, that survived, that are alive today, that number dwindles down to 51,000. So part of the effort, and one of the things that the Trump administration has tried to do, is to now change the definition. Now, what they don't tell you is that even the UNHCR recognizes all descendants of refugees as refugees entitled to the right of return. So what doesn't get played out here is the question of how the Palestinian refugee and the Palestinian, I'm also Palestinian, is framed as a security threat for the mere fact of existing. Because our existence counters the mythology that land, that Jewish Zionists are native to this land, and that somehow we invaded Israel, or that we came from surrounding Arab countries driven by a hatred, an irrational hatred, and therefore we are the security threat. And they actually say, they describe us as a demographic threat because the return of Palestinian refugees is not a threat to any Israeli security or to children or to the livelihood or to jobs. The threat that we pose is that we would disrupt, our presence would disrupt a Jewish demographic majority. In any other situation where we have not exceptionalized this discourse, we would discuss this as blatant racism. And yet in this situation, rather than call it out for racism, because Palestinians are so deeply dehumanized, we start to discuss, what can we do in order to maintain the Jewish demographic majority and to make everyone happy? And so we end up fighting over what remains rather than fighting for what is just.
Thank you. Michael, you were talking about the importance of law. It's a question of law, and there are laws. You are making reports. There are laws. Those laws are broken in some times, in many occasions, during wars, not outside wars, during the occupation. What kind of consequence does your work has? Maybe people don't believe anymore in the UN because there are reports, laws are broken, and there is no punishment, no consequence.
Well, as you can see from this, I'm a glass half full person, and therefore an optimist with respect to what law can wind up achieving. But when I look at law, and I invite you to think about it in this way, we have a great paradox when it comes to the question of Palestine, international law, and the United Nations. There is no other conflict in the world today in which there's been so many UN resolutions from the Security Council, from the General Assembly, from the Human Rights Commission, and others, which have defined and shaped international law with respect to laws of occupation, the rights of refugees, the concept of the illegality of civilian settlements and occupied land, and so on. The law is exceptionally strong. This conflict has contributed more to the development of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, I might say, than probably any other conflict in the world over the last 70 years. But the paradox is that for all of that development of law, all of that rich articulation of values and norms and protections, there is precious little of that has ever spread down to the Palestinians and to the Israelis, for whom that law is supposed to wind up deserving. There is an enormous difference between international promise and international performance. In the Middle East, it's often said, international law is much closer to power than it is to justice. So the question you wind up raising is the question of accountability. And when I look at recent attempts, recent reports, the 2009 Goldstone report with respect to the Gaza war, which was mentioned here, the 2014 Davis report with respect to the 2014 conflict in Gaza, the Commission of Inquiry was just reported 2 weeks ago with respect to the mass shootings at the Gaza frontier throughout 2018. And I can name countless others. All of those continue to demand, continue to ask for the question of accountability, for the question of the end to impunity. This raises a difficult question because you would think that international law is going to be the moral and legal foundation of international diplomacy. We will actually act on the bodies of laws that we've created in the last 75 years to make sure we don't repeat the horrors of the Second World War and what went on before, that we have an international rule of law that now governs us, that international law is the promise that countries make to each other and countries make to their own people in terms of protections of rights. And we're not there yet. And this conflict has among the biggest gaps with respect to accountability. And we wouldn't have, the mass shootings of the Gaza frontier if the country doing that, if the occupying power doing that, thought that it was going to be punished and called up with respect to this by any meaningful process.
Would you say that this conflict, you were saying it is the last occupation in the world?
No, I'm not. No.
Would you say it's the last colonial conflict in the world?
No. I look at other, and this is one of the reasons why I emphasize the importance of international law, and I say we're not simply focusing the spotlight on Israel and the occupation of the Gazans and the Palestinians. Western Sahara. You could argue northern Cyprus as another occupation. A number of other of occupations exist in the world today, and if we wind up getting this right with respect to the occupied Palestinian territory, if we wind up, for example, the UN database, which has once again been pushed off into the future, that database isn't only going to be a model for looking at corporate complicity in the economic development and sustaining of the settlements in the occupied territory. If it's done right, that can help with respect to the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, or what goes on in Cyprus, or what goes on in any other occupation. The laws we talk about, and I talk about in my reports with respect to the OPT, are universal laws, and they're universal rights that people anywhere can claim.
Thank you very much. As the film shows it very well, and as you were saying, the conflict is a conflict of narrative. This conflict is more than others a conflict of narrative. Of course, it's a conflict where people die, where it's a question of territory, but the narrative is more important because of where it happens, because of who it happens, etc., etc. I wanted to ask you, Nora, what kind of echo did it have in the US, the marches of Gaza, which was a try of the Palestinians to change the narrative, to come back to the 80s, to the first Intifada, to become again the small David fighting Goliath with bare hands and trying to put aside the question of terrorism, which is overwhelming. By the way, one of the criticisms I have on the film is that it does not take into account external factors like 11th of September, like the war with Iraq in 91, when Saddam Hussein sided with the Palestinians. It was not a gift for them. When Bin Laden justified the 9/11 by the situation of the Palestinians, they became associated, despite themselves, to this major terror act, which changed totally the vision of the American public. But let's come back to Gaza and the Gaza popular marches.
Yeah. So the Gaza March of Return, Palestinians decide that they are going to resist the siege, that they are going to demand the right of return, they are going to demand the end of the occupation, and they will do it in a mass civil mobilization that begins on Land Day, March 30th, which commemorates the murder of 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel in 1976, and will last until May 15th, which is the day of the Nakba, or the catastrophe, as you learned here. So very much emphasizing the holistic nature of the Palestinian nature without regard to these legal demarcations between the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. We're all one people. Very much emphasizing the rights-based nature, very much emphasizing the right of return, okay? This is a big deal. Everywhere you go, if there's Palestinians here, you all know the number one question you'll get, if there was only a Palestinian Gandhi, then you all would be free. If you just stop with the rockets, then you all would be free. You just need a peace movement. And it angers me so much because we have thousands and thousands of Gandhis. We have thousands that nobody is paying attention to. And the most grotesque example was when 45,000 Palestinians marched by foot on their own and were premeditatedly by the head of the armed security forces, Gabi Eskonot, the Israeli security forces, said that before they even started, that you will use excessive force. This was an army order. And that the next day, after the killing of 14 Palestinians on the first day of March 30th, Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign deputy minister, says that there will be no international and no domestic investigation. So we get Israelis telling us from the beginning, we will use force, there will be no investigation. There's 30,000 to 45,000 Palestinians marching. We've never seen this anywhere in the world. This mass mobilization, you've been waiting for the Gandhi, and yet you have Israeli snipers shooting from 200 to 300 meters away on hilltops across a militarized frontier, shooting to kill Palestinians. I've been counted in the reports, 90%, above 90% of the Palestinians killed were shot above the waist, in the stomach, the head, the neck, and the back, even as they were running away. This should have been a sea change and how we describe the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And yet the discussion remained that this was orchestrated by Hamas, and that the Supreme Court decision, that the Israeli Supreme Court decision on May 24th, which was 9 days after the largest killing of Palestinians in one day, where they killed 58 Palestinians on May 15th, the Israeli Supreme Court said that popular protests are Hamas's new weapons. So you're basically telling Palestinians, no matter what you do, no matter how you protest, no matter how peacefully, how valiantly, how inspiring you are, we will criminalize you and blame you for your own death. And so this really is a crisis in an international conscience. And I hate that we always blame the United States, because we have an entire international community that frankly didn't protest that much anyway.
No, but I'm not blaming. I'm just asking if there was any.
Well, I'm not defending the U.S. I just think that all of us.
No, but was there any kind of? Was there any kind of shake into
This is the shake. I'll tell you the shake. I remember because I was part of interviews around this time, and I've never gotten that much attention. And I thought it was crazy, and then I realized what it was. Is that it was because I think that it was because the Trump administration was involved in this and moved the embassy on the same day. Yeah. So that the response was less a response to what Palestinians have done and more of a response that they wanted to be angry at Trump. Again, this is the danger of not paying attention to what we're doing. I do not think that there was a change in discourse. In fact, most U.S. headlines read that Hamas in the day of the massacre, that Hamas ruins Israeli celebrations when they move the embassy to Jerusalem.
To continue with this question, the end of the film is, yes, quite optimistic. What is, you are working on in US campuses, have you noticed this, a major change among the young generation, the so-called, what we call in France, Y, yes, generation? And is it only in campuses, or is it concerning Americans who are not East Coast educated people, let's say?
I want to agree with Michael here and end on a very positive note and the glass half full, because I am too an optimist. I'm an organizer and an activist before anything else. And so that means I have to have faith that things will change, because you cannot maintain such an unsustainable form of oppression, stark oppression, indefinitely. In the US, let me tell you this, there has been a sea change amongst a grassroots population where Palestine has become squarely a progressive issue. And for the first time ever, we see a bipartisan split amongst, not necessarily, yes, the Democrats and the Republicans remain aligned, but in the base of the Democrats and the Republicans, there is a shift where Palestine is increasingly part of a progressive platform. You can't be cool anymore if you don't understand this. And Israel has become an increasingly right-wing issue. And that has to do
the base of the Republican...
not the Republicans, the base of the Democrats.
Ah, okay.
But it's becoming, this is the best thing that can happen. It's becoming a Republican issue. Right? It's becoming the symbol of the separation of families at the border, of building a militarized frontier along the Mexican-American border. It's becoming the symbol of the shoot-to-kill policies of African Americans, of police officers who can shoot to kill African Americans with impunity. It's become a symbol of mass incarceration, that 1 out of every 3 black men is incarcerated when black Americans represent only 12% of the population. When that agenda becomes aligned with Israel, it's a good thing for Palestinians. It's a good thing, and it's been adopted by the Black Lives Matter movement. It's been adopted by the Women's March. It's been adopted on campuses. It's now part of Bernie Sanders' platform. But all of that to say that as we see this shift, the other thing that we see is the most hostile repression of Palestinian activism as well. 41 out of 50 states in the United States have either proposed or passed legislation that criminalizes BDS. And now we saw recently, you might have all seen this, that there was a concerted attack against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar for criticizing Israel as well.
I was about to ask you about this, the new wave of young Democrats who were elected into the Congress. Are they different, and do they manage to come with their ideas or not?
No, that's an American question.
Americans always take up too much space. This is the problem. This is the problem. This is the thing. We are an imperial power. What the U.S. is doing in the Middle East is not a result of just a Hasbara or of the Israel lobby. We are fulfilling an imperial agenda for hegemony and control. And so I will decline to say, let me make more space.
Okay.
But if I can...
I was interested into the repression of the BDS movement because it seems that Israel feels it's more dangerous than others' PR threats.
Yeah. But if I can add with respect to the issue of a glass half full and optimism, because my optimism is, as the special rapporteur comes from a different source that Nora's does, but I'm sure she'd find inspiration in this as well, is that in the course of my work, I deal a lot with civil society in Palestine, a lot with civil society in Israel, and internationally as well. All of these are highly respected, highly effective human rights defenders and advocates. And whenever these days I feel down, and that's probably 2 days out of 7 each week, I look to the kind of work that groups like B'Tselem or Gisha or the Association for Civil Liberties, Civil Rights in Israel, or groups like Al-Mizan or Al-Haq or the Palestinian Center for Human Rights does, or Amnesty or Human Rights Watch does on Israel and Palestine. These Israelis, these Palestinians all speak the same international language of rights. They all work from the same documents. They're all building precious, important bridges to each other's societies. And at the end of the day, you know, the 13 million people who live there presently between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean aren't going anywhere. And the only way they're going to ever be able to live in an area beyond conflict is when human rights and political rights and civil rights are recognized equally for all. And it's these organizations that are the genesis for what the future is likely to bring. It may be longer, it may be shorter. The kind of work we show internationally is a good step towards making that wait shorter than it is longer. But Israel is not a monolith society. And there are many Israelis of conscience who respect and work very assiduously on human rights. And these same Israelis of conscience will also say, only through international action will we bring an end to the occupation. It's not going to happen any other way. And they're looking for support from Europe, from North America, and elsewhere.
Yes, but I'm sorry to interrupt. Why, when there are elections, we don't see those people?
Yeah. And you're right. And
how do you explain that?
The Israeli popular opinion is moving rightward. None of the major Israeli parties have anything of a two-state solution, let alone any solution to the Palestinian issue beyond them there and us here with respect to this. In the short run, there's all kinds of reasons to want to wind up feeling gloomy with respect to the current state of Israeli politics. But if I'm going to give you hope, and I'm going to show you that there are bridges between these societies that we don't pay attention to and that we underestimate, it's these human rights activists that I want to be able to point to.
Do you think that Israel is afraid that this international movement meets a national movement and uses the kind of instruments you are building at the UN, like this database of the economic occupation, which at the end will end up as it ended up in South Africa?
Look,
I mean, but you cannot compare everything because the South African conflict did not end up with a two-state solution.
No, it didn't. You know, I'll leave it for others to figure out what the proper solution is, if it's a two-state or one-state solution with respect to Palestine. But, you know, with all the differences there are between apartheid South Africa and Israel and Palestine, there are many lessons to be learned with respect to international action that helped bring apartheid to an end. And those are some of the same sorts of issues, countermeasures, if you like, that wind up addressing the question of accountability. And if I can give you a preview of my next report come October is going to be on, it's going to be on the legal issue of third-party responsibility. It's going to be on the issue of accountability. It's going to be looking at the issues of what the United Nations and other international institutions and organizations have done in the last 50 to 60 years with respect to countermeasures where there are situations of gross human rights violations. Those are lessons that we can wind up applying or thinking about applying when it comes to Israel. Sometimes sanctions don't work. Sometimes countermeasures are weak. But if they're done in a measured, proper way, and it's going to have to be civil society that arises and demands that of their governments, and saying the continuation of a 52-year-old occupation is intolerable, and we've got to reframe the issue back into an issue of rights and justice, then that's where we're going to wind up heading, and that's what I hope my next report is going to contribute to.
Interesting. Before giving the floor to the audience, I have a very last question for the citizen of East Jerusalem. we were quite pessimistic by saying there is nothing to discuss. There is no state to discuss about, because physically there cannot be any sovereign, independent Palestinian state today. How do you explain this paradox that Israel has never been in a better situation in terms of strategically, but what will Israel do with the 2.5 million of Palestinians in the West Bank, and even the Gaza people who are living under a kind of occupation, because if they starve, Israel is responsible for it. So how do you think the Israeli society or state can solve this never-ending question, which is being Jewish or democratic?
Well, I just noticed that everybody's talking about the cup half full, half empty. So I put some water. So
yeah, I will finish I will finish mine.
I mean, going around in the refugee camps in Syria, and when you see the destruction of Yarmouk and Dera and Spain, and then you have the opportunity between brackets to go to Gaza repeatedly and then to go to the West Bank every day, you tend to develop certain pessimistic views, if you like, because you live the day-to-day in that sense. But looking at it strategically, the same kids who have their legs amputated because of the sniper bullets that Nora was talking about are the most, amazing kids, and they score the best, grades, and they want to graduate, and they want to be surgeons, and they want to be doctors. And when you go to Yarmouk camp, and when you see these kids who survived the horrors of the destruction of Yarmouk camp, and so Daesh holding a severed head every day, every time they cross the checking point to go to their school, and then these kids in the Yarmouk school scored the highest marks in all of Syria, and then the examples multiply, then you say, yes, that the future is with these kids. They're making their own future despite old people like me who tends to be pessimistic more than, I should have put more water here, so this is, but I thank you. But, and here I'm talking specifically and exclusively as a Palestinian refugee. I think Israel is the victim of its own success. And I think they're stuck. The Palestinians have internalized the process is, you could demolish my house once, twice, 3 times. I'm not going anywhere. And the issue of demography is the elephant in the room in that sense, because at the end of the day, despite all the attempts to Judaize, if you like, the West Bank, as they say it, despite all the attempts to bring in settlers into East Jerusalem and into the West Bank, at the end of the day, the numbers are equal in that sense. And that is a message that there's 2 ways. Either we keep fighting at it, or we sit down and find a solution that also meets my basic human rights and my basic rights in totality as yours in that sense. Otherwise, it's going to be an endless, I'm not going to say endless cycle of violence, because it's sometimes, or most of the times, it's a one-way imposed cycle of violence on the other group of people. And I hate this, the playing field in the terminology in the media, especially in the Western media, is so unfair in that particular sense. East Jerusalem is occupied territory. It's an extension of the occupied territory in that sense. And UNRWA's role is not, and this is about, by the way, about the narrative. Sometimes many people impose narratives on the Palestinians, whether well-intended or ill-intended in that sense, and that sometimes we find ourselves as UNRWA also adopting the narrative on behalf of the Palestinians without allowing the Palestinian refugees their own voices. And I think also this trend is also changes. I think the trajectory is positive, and I think tomorrow is for the kids. UNRWA is not for sale. UNRWA is going to stay next to the Palestinians until the rights of Palestinian refugees is addressed according to the will of the people themselves. That is basically why I wake up every morning and work for UNRWA.
Thank you very much. So now it's time for questions from you. We have like 20, 25, even 25 minutes, half an hour. I will just ask you to try to ask short questions and not make too long statements. So we will take maybe 3 and then another batch of 3. So here, one in the middle.
Can I already talk or?
Allez-y.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to thank to all of you and really to express my admire for Noura. Really, thank you so much. You are great. Just continue like this. It's fantastic to hear everything what is hurting us here. We cannot do really much, and we feel like kind of taken into hostage, seeing what is happening with Palestinians and not to being able to do much. So my question would be for all of you. Mr. Here, I forgot the name, I'm sorry. You were kind of praising international law, and I admit it would be nice to believe in international law and to believe also in justice and UN. Personally, I do not believe anymore, not in UN, not in international justice, not in international laws. So you were telling also later that the way to proceed is that human rights civil activists, they act and they make pressure to their governments. Yeah, is it correct? Yeah, so I would like to know finally, so what would be the best solution to help Palestinians? Is it to concentrate on national level and to make pressure to the national governments and to forget about UN, international justice and international laws? So what would be the best way?
Okay, thank you very much. Another 2 questions, maybe here. We will take the front row and then the last.
Sorry, my question might be very naive, but I try to follow up with all these questions. But what is the main solution if the 1967 frontiers doesn't work, if 2 states doesn't work? What would be, according to you, the panel, the best solution? Because Israel is now there, Palestinians are there. What is the solution?
Okay, thank you very much. Another question here.
Hello. Thank you very much. This is the 3rd time that I've seen this film, so I think it's excellent. This is an American question. A year or 2 ago, I heard Roger Waters and the filmmaker interviewed on Democracy Now! And one of the things they said was they had great difficulty getting the film screened in the US. So I'd like to know if now it's being shown or if there are still obstacles to this film.
Thank you. So maybe the last question is the easiest one, because we will keep the solution for the end. Sorry, it's a joke. Noura, is this film easy to see and to screen in the US?
No, it's not. And I want to respond to all the questions, but really briefly, no, it's not. And what I want to say right now is that what we're experiencing in the United States is one of the harshest forms of repression of Palestinian activism. The rescindment of tenure for scholars like Stephen Salaita. It is the punishment, it's the attempt by the Senate to criminalize BDS activism through 20 years of imprisonment and $250,000 of civil fines. It's the 41 out of 50 states who are passing anti-BDS legislation. It's the expulsion and the suspension of student activists. It's the changing of the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. I mean, it's the worst. It's the worst. But here's the half full. That harsh repression is actually a signal of weakness, because a strong movement can actually work to establish some sort of hegemony where a population reproduces consent on their own without that coercive force. The fact that the state needs to mobilize such hostile coercive force is an indication that that hegemony is dwindling, and that in fact the taboo over Israel is crumbling in the United States, where they no longer have control over this issue. So I would see it as a duality, that even though we can't see this, we should take faith that Israel is actually at its greatest, at its most weak now in terms of controlling the discussion.
So to answer the first question, which was, shall the activists concentrate on the national level or international level?
And part of that question as well went to international law. And I say international law is a vitally important part of this struggle, but it's all by itself insufficient. International law has to be a tool along with political mobilization and civic engagement by those who care about social justice and see that as being extended to the issue of Palestine. International law is important because in a world that's divided by race, by religion, by gender, by ideology, it's the one secular common achievement that we have the world over. Every single country buys into the body of international law in general and international human rights law in particular. We can use that as our common touchstone to say this action is right and this action is indefensible. So therefore it becomes, I think, an important mobilizing tool, not just for lawyers, because international law isn't meant for lawyers. International law is meant as a protection for all of us. So it's an important tool to wind up using, and that's why I feel optimistic about this, and particularly when it comes to Palestine. The law is overwhelmingly on the side of issues of self-determination, of the end of occupation, of the illegality of the settlements. So many of the things that we see are at the heart of the injustice that goes on in Palestine are commented upon and disapproved by and prohibited by international law. But it should be part of the information that we build upon to make our leaders wind up changing their points of view. I remember reading, as a young labor lawyer, about what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said in the 1930s. And he said, basically, to the social activists who wanted better labor laws, better social welfare laws, he says, I agree with you, but you've got to go out and make me do it. You've got to go out and do the activism yourself to change public opinion so that I, as a political leader, wind up agreeing with you, as I now have the base of support, and that's the same thing with respect to this.
The $1 billion question, what is the solution? I would say I would add something to the question, which is during it seems that the diplomats are still sticking to the two-state solution, and that people even say now, I'm ready to a one-state solution as far as I'm respected as a normal citizen, as I have my rights. So are we seeing the comeback of the one-state solution? Because a viable Palestine is not possible without wiping too many settlements, or shall we stick to the two-state solution and try to minimize the exchange of land, so that we stick to almost the 67
Sure. If I can start off, but I think all three of us probably have
opinions. All three, I guess you have your opinion.
She have an opinion.
Yeah. I think maybe the way to look at this, I think there are four distinct futures that may happen with respect to this. One is a genuine two-state solution where there is a border that more or less goes along the 1967 border of what diplomats say is possible. Secondly is a one-state democratic solution where there are 13 million people who live there all have a common vote, and they've figured out some kind of federation or confederation relationship based on equality. A third solution is a one-state solution with one ethnic group, Israeli Jews dominating the other, which approximates some form of apartheid. And the fourth, which is not a solution, but is the, in fact, continuation of what we have now well into the future without a formal annexation taking place. Those, I think, are the four choices in front of us. I don't see any others with respect to this. And if you start to see even honest, middle-of-the-road columnists, I mostly read the North American press. The deputy managing editor from the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, American Jewish himself, said that increasingly any informed observer would say that the two-state solution is a cruel joke. And you see now the New York Times beginning to say that in their editorials, the Guardian saying that in their editorials. There is a seepage away from that, even if the diplomatic mantra continues to be two-state solution. I think the support for a two-state solution and the recognition that would ever happen under current circumstances is dwindling away and evaporating.
Nora.
So I want to start by actually moving back to the role of international law, because it's connected to my vision for solution, because it's connected to my book project. And so this is not a shameless plug, although if you're interested, the book is called Justice for Some, Law on the Question of Palestine. And I agree with Michael in respects that the law is a tool and it can be used for good. But what I demonstrate in the book is that, in fact, in the course of this 100-year, if we begin in 1917, 100-plus year struggle for Palestinian freedom, what we see is that Israel has been more successful in using the law to take the land, to consolidate its holdings, and to legitimate its use of force and kill an increasingly number of Palestinian civilians. Something's wrong there. Now, that doesn't mean I would throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I do believe that international law, like any other structural asymmetry, military, economic, political, is one that we have to grapple with. So it's not that, okay, well, the law does bad things, therefore we shouldn't use it. It's that the law does bad things, so how do we leverage it in order to achieve our strategic goals? And so if you're interested to see how that turns out, that's the book part. But so here's where it connects to the solution. So I finished this project of writing this book, and I get to the end, and I'm like, oh my God, I did all of this work. I've studied all of this history. I finally gotten to the end, and I'm about to articulate the 4 solutions that my esteemed colleague is articulating, which frankly were articulated in 1947. It was deliberated by the UN Special Committee on Palestine. These are the same solutions we've had for decades. And what I found, and what I was struggling with, is that when we simply think of this as a political issue, what politics does is it forces us to negotiate a limited amount of resources. So when some have, others don't. Right? It's a mutually exclusive equation. And that equation has not borne out any fruitful results. So I had to think of something else beyond this. And one of my very good friends inspired me to think about this issue at the end of the book through something called Afrofuturism, which is a form of literature and African thought of imagining futures that don't even exist. And at first I thought she was crazy, but she's right. Because if African slaves in the United States only believed that their future was possible through the possibility of escaping their slaveholder through a window or across the field or far enough where they wouldn't get caught or across a border into a free state without being forcibly returned, it's really daunting. You almost want to give up. That's daunting to only think of those possibilities. And so instead, you have to imagine that a better future is possible and instill that as a culture and as a norm. You have to dream. We often think of dreaming as something that's naive, idealistic, artists can do it. But dreaming is the most radical political act possible. Dreaming is what makes these other possibilities seem less and less and less silly and more possible. So I dreamed, and the dream that I have is, what if we begin to think about a solution in Palestine, one, where the solution for Palestinians is not just the solution for this Palestinian condition, but offers a solution for people all over the world. Somehow becomes a solution not just for Palestinian refugees to return, but becomes a solution that envisions possibilities in the world where all refugees are welcome everywhere in any place. Where what we do for Palestine, yeah, all right, yeah, go ahead, I agree. But what we do for Palestine, we're also envisioning what is going to be done for the Western Sahara, what can be done for the Rohingya, what is going to be done, for example, in the United States with native populations and otherwise. Okay, so that was one. How does the solution in Palestine, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, also become a solution for the African asylum seekers now in Palestine, 12,000 who will be sent back to their death by the Israeli government, right? So that brought me to the second thing. If politics is about partitioning and a mutually exclusive equation, what equations are not mutually exclusive but mutually reinforcing? And the one that makes the most sense to me is that we shift our thinking, not who controls Palestine or who is sovereign in Palestine or who governs Palestine, but who belongs there. And all of us can belong there. All of us can belong there. And this requires, especially for Jewish Zionists, to begin to think that if they in fact want to belong in Palestine, they want to be there, then they have to reimagine what it means to belong in the Middle East. They can no longer continuously be in Palestine as a satellite state for settlers so that they can belong in Europe and be from elsewhere. Belonging in the Middle East means accepting Arab language and culture, and Islamic culture as well, and Arab language. This is what happens to the Middle Eastern Jews who are in Israel treated horribly, who were kidnapped, who are abducted from their Yemeni children, or abducted from their families to be civilized by Ashkenazi families, who were placed on the periphery in order to be cannon fodder during warfare. So how is it that if we truly want to imagine belonging, we begin to imagine belonging in a radical way where we can all be there? But that means that the Jewish Israelis who want to belong there have to stop belonging there as masters and as settlers, and indeed begin to belong as part of the region. That's my vision.
That's a tough act to follow, I tell you. But I mean, I really would love to live long. I'm a smoker, and I just really would love to live long, just to see this materialize. I will pay serious money just to see this unfold. I'm dreaming. I'm gonna start dreaming from tonight on this one. But until this dream materializes, I'm afraid that the only option on the table from an international, if you like, not international perspective, from nation states, is the two-state solution, a dwarfed two-state solution. Because the new thing that they're talking about now is a two-state solution with land swaps, meaning I will take parts of the West Bank where the bulk of the Israeli settlers live, and there's almost 450,000 of them, and I will give the Palestinians parts of the desert in that sense, with the hope, and also taking what we call the triangle, which is where most Palestinians in 1948 live. So I will take this part of the land, and then I'll give them the desert, and I will create a new reality manifested in a new two-state solution. And you would notice that from the get-go, when they were talking about the two-state solution, Gaza was not in the plan. Because when the Oslo was signed, they talked about a safe passage, literally a bridge, where Gazans and the West Bankers will be able to travel under Israeli control. This was dead upon arrival. This was, as envisioned, did not happen. So sadly, and I think I will stop smoking and stop actually drinking so that we'll reach this one, and dreaming. But I think that's what we're basically going at. Clapping that, I'll stop smoking and drinking, so thank you.
But have a drink with us tonight.
Alors, d'autres questions? Deux là-bas. Trois. Donc, on va prendre 1, 2, 3.
Hi. Anna Aznaou, Swiss independent journalist. My question is for Madame Erakat. In 214, the Operation Protective Border, the bombing of Gaza, was explained by the protection of Israel. In 217, several reports, even Israeli reports, confirmed that this aggression was not justified. My question is, what was the consequence, juridical and financial consequence for Israel after this? And my question is inspired by the events of this night, because Gaza this night was again bombed by Israel. They said that they bombed because of 2 rocket strikes made by Hamas, but Hamas say that they are not the authors of these rocket strikes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, but we will take several questions at once.
Thank you for an excellent discussion and for 3 lively people. Thank you so much to Palestinians for having so much soul and for keeping humanity despite the oppression. And I wanted to say that apartheid stopped because there was such a boycott that finally the leaders, the white leaders, realized that they were shooting themselves in the foot. And the Israeli government is constantly shooting itself in the foot. They are dehumanizing their population, they're dehumanizing their country, they're doing to others what was done to Jews. And I think that the only way it is in practical going to be solved, in order to then go to the step of dreaming, is that worldwide people go forward with a boycott to such an extent that finally Israel realizes that they have to speak, they have to negotiate. And I'm just so desperate with the issue of the settlements, because it is ripping of the Palestinians to be able to live in a dignified way.
Thank you. So mostly the question is about boycott. Okay. Monsieur?
First, thank you for this discussion. My question is, for the first time, the American has used in their annual report about the human rights situation in the world, Palestinian territories in the state of occupied Palestinian territories. So how do you explain this shifting in language? Thank you.
Okay. There was, I think, a last question, Madame, and that's all. Then we will have to leave.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question about apartheid, a word which was talked about just a bit. There has been a change. In 2017, Richard Falk, one of your predecessors, and Virginia Tilley wrote a judicial argumentation showing that Israel, in all of Israel, not only in the occupied territories, but in Israel itself, uses a policy of apartheid. Apartheid under international law is a crime against humanity, and the people or the states are supposed to do something about this. But as you have mentioned, the law doesn't come about by itself. So I think if we put ourselves in the point of view of activists, I think we really have to stress that Israel is an apartheid state. And if the Falk and Tilley report is not read by very many people, the law passed by the Knesset last July, saying that Israel is a state for the citizens who are of the Jewish confession only. So we have to, in our working places, in our discussions with people, show that apartheid is intolerable. This is not acceptable. That Swiss companies cannot be doing business with Israeli companies. That the Swiss government cannot pass law in the military department continually buy Israeli drones, which will be then used against the Swiss who are dissenting about the refugee policies and other things.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would like just to hear your opinion on the use of apartheid.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I will give my answer as well, because I worked several years on the issue. And I would say that not everybody agrees, and this is the problem with this conflict, on the description of the conflict. Maybe we all think the same here, but outside this panel, it's not always the case. And I don't think it is a good thing for the Palestinians to try to put other concepts on what is happening. Apartheid is a concept. You can discuss it during hours and hours and hours. Apartheid has an history. Maybe there should be another word to try to describe the kind of discrimination Palestinians are suffering inside and outside Israel. Because, of course, we are talking about as well about Palestinian Israelis. But I'm not sure that you would find a consensus among the UN on this word of apartheid, or you would find a consensus on the concept of boycott inside the Swiss society, inside the European societies, or inside the UN. So if you want to be efficient, you have to think globally. I don't mean that everybody has to agree on everything, but sometimes if you want to recruit a large audience, you have to adapt to it. There are people who, for example, want to boycott companies who are working in the occupied territories. Others want to boycott all the Israeli companies because they consider that the whole Israel is an apartheid state. So there are different point of views on this issue of boycott, and even inside the pro-Palestinian movement. But this is only my opinion. I think you have yours.
We both want to answer that, so do you want to go first?
Go ahead. Okay, I'll try. In terms of the questions that have been asked, and I'll be very quick because I know the hour is drawing late. With respect to settlements, the settlements are obviously the photo negative of Palestinian self-determination. The whole point of moving civilian settlers into the occupied territory is to establish a claim for sovereignty in the occupied land, which is a forbidden exercise since the end of the Second World War. That is firmly established in the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. It is a war crime under the 1998 Statute of Rome, and an anachronism from a practice that existed before the Second World War. And it's rightly condemned, and yet it shows, as many of you have pointed out in your questions tonight, the enormous gap between international law promise and international law practice. But I just warn you of one thing when it comes to international law. I think it's entirely acceptable to be skeptical about the law's promise, but I think it's wrong for any of us to fall into the trap of being cynical about what the law can wind up doing, because the law can be a very powerful tool, both as a campaign tool and as a legal force in the right judicial forms. The second point I made is a question that came from the fact that the State Department has now, in the last day, removed the word occupied with respect to its definition of Israeli control over the Palestinian territory. And I've got to say, this comes close to being flat earth thinking. It is such a broad, unanimous agreement among every country in the world, except for Israel, and perhaps now with respect to the Trump administration's State Department, that this is an occupation. It is governed by the Fourth Geneva Convention. There are hundreds of UN General Assembly resolutions. There are around 26 Security Council resolutions. There's no concept in UN resolutions more firmly established than that this is occupied territory governed by the Fourth Geneva Convention. And my last comment has to do with the term apartheid. And what I will say to this, and it's something I haven't actually addressed directly as a special rapporteur, but I read the Israeli press all the time. I read what human rights activists among Israelis wind up saying. And that the term apartheid is regularly used by Israeli human rights activists. It's used by Michael Safard, who's the leading human rights lawyer in Israel. It's used by Zev Sternhal, who is one of the leading Israeli intellectuals. It's used by two former Israeli prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, to describe what could be happening in the occupied territories. And whenever I'm challenged, when someone says to me, well, is it apartheid? And I say back to them, well, look, if you want to find a less harsh word, please give me one that tries to, but show me an accurate definition of where there is two separate laws, two separate roads, two separate social systems, two separate sets of political and civil rights for two different peoples divided by ethnicity in the same geographic area. You find me a better word than apartheid, then I'm willing to use it. But until then, that may have to be the accurate description.
I have Okay, I want to echo that and then answer this question, this easy question about Gaza. But in terms of apartheid, and this was the primary critique, that it's so specific to the experience of South Africa and Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, that we should not apply it elsewhere. It's almost like calling a genocide a Holocaust, because the Holocaust has been described as the elimination, mass elimination, attempt and elimination of Jewish people under the Third Reich. And so here's the difference. Apartheid in 1973 was consecrated as a crime against humanity by the UN General Assembly and has been legislated as a legal crime against humanity with 6 subparts that we can apply. So now we have the tools to apply a legal analysis to the situation in ways that Michael has summarized for us. So that's the task, and we've done it. And it's not just, I love Virginia Tilley and Richard Falk very much, but Palestinians have been doing that work for a long time and describing it as such as early as 2000, and the collapse of the peace process and the aftermath of the failure of the Camp David talks in 2000. Badil has called it apartheid. And what we saw recently, here's the thing, and here's where international law is related to this. December 2016, UN Security Council resolution passes Resolution 2334, condemning the settlements and basically reifying the possibility of a two-state solution. Come now 8 months later, about in July 2017, now ESCWA, UN ESCWA, releases this report that basically says, look, this is not a two-state solution or a political conflict. This is a situation of apartheid. What happens? And this is how you know that international law doesn't interpret itself. Both of these are legal analyses. But what we see happen is that the ESCWA resolution is shelved. It had to be leaked. And the head of UN ESCWA resigned, Rima Khalaf resigned in protest of this happening. Meanwhile, UN Security Council Resolution 2334 is celebrated. So just think that the law is doing something more than we assume what it's doing. It's also reaffirming what is impossible and what is possible. And it's limiting our imagination. And here it's not just the Israelis and the US that shelved ESCWA. The fact that the Palestinian leadership has not affirmed that they're living under an apartheid situation and have not insisted and not endorsed boycott, divestment, and sanctions in response to that, and have not run with ESCWA, also points responsibility to Palestinians ourselves, who are part of the problem. So here you have a very complicated situation where, yes, we can call it apartheid, yes, we can prove it, yes, we can have UN resolutions, and who is responsible for it? So this is about a political will as well, which is very similar in the Gaza. How is it possible? How is it possible that in 51 days there are 50,000 artillery shells and 6,000 airstrikes on a besieged population, where 80% of the population is basically food insecure, and Israel is not prosecuted at all? I mean, these are the questions I ask myself. And what I found in the course of answering that question is that Israel has actually changed the laws of war, changed the definition of proportionality, changed the definition of distinction, so that if we were to go to the International Criminal Court, they have a legal argument to basically explain how, and this is what Asa Kasher and Amos Yadlin, who are the ethicists that rewrite Israeli rules of engagement in 2003, they basically argue that it makes no sense to compare the number of Israeli civilians to Palestinian civilians dead anymore. They are changing the law. Now, how can they change the law? And this is where, how is customary international, this may be too complicated, but let me just add this. Again, there's no conspiracy. Arab states have agreed and colluded with this reinterpretation. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are having their armed forces trained in Israel and have participated. Egypt has participated and colluded in the blockade of Gaza. So now you have a much more complicated question where the region has changed so much, where this is why we're not able to challenge the law. And the law that we see change for Israel vis-a-vis Gaza is why we're seeing certain things happen in Syria and why we see certain things happen in Yemen. So the threat is not just to Palestinians and accountability in Gaza, it's actually a threat to the world, and why we should be paying attention to this.
Thank you. I think it's time now we have to give back the room. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your participation. It was a great and very rich discussion.